Otto Perez Molina today in Guatemala is announcing his presidential campaign.
So again, thank you all for coming here today. And the reason that we're here today is because of the upcoming visit of General Otto Perez Molina to Washington, D.C. The U.S. does not welcome war criminals. The United States does not welcome torturers. And the United States does not give visas to people who are guilty of genocide.
He is well known and recognized in the Ixil area, but throughout Quiché, as having been a military commander during the genocide. Approximately half of the massacres that were documented by the UN-sponsored Truth Commission occurred in Quiché. Many of those undoubtedly under the command of Otto Perez Molina, over 300 massacres. In the Ixil area, the Truth Commission estimates that between 70 and 90% of all villages were razed to the ground.
We're angry that our government continues to support those groups, army groups, who perpetrate murder and what we call in Latin America matanzas.
There are some principles of human rights law that do not only bind Guatemala but also bind this country.
Indigenous organizations have been organizing since approximately the late 1950s or earlier. So what the army really did was to crash that movement.
Those principles are the ones that should tell us and should tell the State Department and Congress that Otto Perez Molina should never, ever be allowed in this country unless he's taken to jail.
Yeah. My name is Jennifer Harbury, and I'm a United States citizen. I'm a lawyer. I've done civil rights work since 1978. And my husband was Efrain Bamaca Velazquez. He was picked up by the Guatemalan military in 1992. He was tortured for at least 2 years, possibly 3, and he's now forcibly disappeared. And General Otto Perez Molina had everything to do with that.
Is Otto Perez Molina responsible for war crimes in the Quiché area in 1982? And when he was head of intelligence? Of course. Why is he being allowed in this country? Why are we pretending that none of this happened?
Everardo was the head of the Luis Ixmata Frente of Orpa, and he was captured alive by the forces of the Special Task Force Quetzal on March the 12th, 1992. And that same day he was captured, they killed a young soldier by beating him to death and crushing his face, leaving him at the combat site and saying, "That's the dead person we found yesterday," so that we would all think that Everardo was dead and not come looking for him.
Everardo for the next 2 years was then always in torture centers from one military base to another. He was transported in intelligence helicopters and interrogated by intelligence officials all over the country. Who was the head of intelligence? Otto Perez Molina.
We know that he was taken from there to the capital, where he was severely tortured again for a long period of time at La Isla, which is a very notorious military compound that was famous for its torture.
Those people had Everardo in their hands for perhaps another 6 months or a year. Who was their immediate supervisor? Otto Perez Molina.
There's a large degree of control of the press. When Otto Perez Molina was interviewed by CNN in Miami earlier this year, there was not one question about his role in the war, when Guatemala has a history in which the military conducted genocide against its own population. 250,000 people were killed, 93% of those by the army, and not one question by CNN of what was your role in that war. So there's an effective press blackout, and people in Guatemala either don't know who he is or are terrified by him.
They will not be silent because we will not be silent. I invite you to speak out loud, very loud, the names of those people you want to remember, and we will, as is the custom, respond presente.
The people of those areas.
Presente.
people of the above.
Edmundo Maldonado. Presente. Canakil, Soloche, Pitzecal, Checocor, Chacpic, Tu, Akul, Chechocon, and the list goes on. 662 massacres.
Presente. I know that Otto Perez Molina was a School of the Americas graduate. That is public information that's listed at the School of the Americas watch. He was head of intelligence as well, and he rose to power as a high-level, very experienced intelligence official throughout the 80s. You heard yourself, he was part of the massacre campaign in the Quiché. All of those things would have made him very attractive, certainly, to Department of Defense or CIA intelligence networks. All I can say is he's repeatedly been protected again and again and again by our embassy and by our military complex. Why?
What happens in Guatemala is very heavily impacted by what happens in the United States. What happens behind these doors dictates a lot of what's going on with politics in Guatemala.
Otto Perez Molina, in his 2007 presidential campaign, was widely thought of to be the embassy candidate. Every election in Guatemala, there's some candidate that the population sees as being the embassy candidate, the U.S. embassy candidate, the one that is backed by or supported by the State Department. And so across Latin America, presidential candidates hire lobbyists before they initiate their presidential campaigns in order to enlist the support of the State Department of the U.S. government. And even, as the awareness of who Otto Perez Molina is, what his war crimes were, how he ran torture programs, how he ran genocide, still has maintained close relations with the U.S. Embassy in Guatemala City.
I stand before you today as a witness to the genocide in Guatemala. When I was called to carry out research by the United Nations Youth Commission, I never imagined what I was going to find.
Well, I started going down to Guatemala in '85, and pretty much everyone I knew back then is gone. There are survivors, but not many. And the devastation, the human devastation that I saw, just the ungodly psychological abuse of everybody in the city, everybody in the countryside. The first case that I looked at when I got down there was Rosario Godoy de Cuevas, who was one of the founders of the group looking for the disappeared, the GAM. And she was looking for her husband, who had been head of the student council at the university, nothing worse than that, and he'd been disappeared for a year. And during Easter week, they grabbed her and her baby and her younger brother, and they were found dead at the base of a shallow hill just outside the capital with broken necks. And it was immediately declared a car crash, a very tragic accident, by the U.S. Embassy. And a nun came forward, an elderly nun, who said, "That's not true. We saw the bodies." And Rosario and her brother were buried like this in their coffins with their arms crossed as good Catholics, but the baby was laid out like that with his arms up at his side. So she went around the room and asked everybody, "What's going on? Why is the baby laid out like that? Why aren't his arms crossed?" And finally someone said, "There's only one survivor in the family and the phone's ringing off the hook with death threats. Just go look at the hands, but don't say anything else." And she had the courage to go up and turn the baby's hands over in the coffin, and his fingernails had all been pulled out. And I had heard so many horrific stories by then from people in the massacres in Quiché and Huehuetenango. I thought I'd heard everything, but somehow that one destroys me every time I think about it. Why don't I like impunity? For the same reason I do like Nuremberg. If the top people who planned and ordered those kinds of atrocities really go to prison and really see justice, then it will not happen again.
Guatemala is suffering from levels of violence similar to what they experienced during the war. It's warlike levels of violence. His campaign strategy in Guatemala is the hard fist against crime, mano duro. Otto Perez Molina invokes fear in the population in general that know who he is. Those that don't are terrorized by the high levels of violence and his hard fist against crime campaign may appeal to them. The reality is that the organized crime networks and drug networks which today maintain Guatemala in a state of terror were born from the military networks that were death squads in the 1980s, death squads that he was a part of.
Right now, Guatemala is going down in flames. You can't walk down the block. The army has taken its uniforms off and become a giant mafia running drugs and fighting on turf wars with other drug companies and drug runners. It's a disaster, and they're still carrying out the same human rights violations as always, shooting people that try to take over land that is really theirs, beating people in the streets, disappearing people. The country's disintegrating, and it's because we never permitted anyone to be brought to justice. Just like right now, we're bringing in someone known to have participated in genocide and torture and allowing him to say, the emperor is beautifully clothed. We all know the emperor has no clothes. It's time we said so because it's causing a lot of death.
I would like to play for you a tape recording of a group of women in El Quiché in 1982, shortly after a dozen of the men had been lined up and shot point blank near the town hall. And the reason I'm going to play it is I think sometimes the written page just doesn't do justice to the realities of what occurred. So I'd like you to all share this moment with me, and then we'll join Marie Dennis for a reflection.